This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Judge Tom Engel. Tom, who lives in New York City, is visiting this part of the world. And Tom, I know you're a man of many parts here. You've been in different places. Maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the cultural differences between a city like New York and, shall we say, Macon. Some of the things that make New York sort of a special kind of place. What's it like up there now? I mean, is that too much of a softball question, too broad of one? I mean, you have a new mayor.
Yeah, we have a new mayor, and the new mayor isn't doing very well, I don't think, in terms of his popularity, and that may be particularly among white residents in New York City. I can't think of anybody of my acquaintance in New York who thinks he's doing a good job, or who doesn't regret that Michael Bloomberg is no longer mayor. And de Blasio, or as my wife likes to call him, Del Blasio, makes no bones about the fact that he wants to, that he's on the side of the oppressed, he's on the side of the poor, he's on the side of the minorities. And he thinks that's a way to, I think, politically ascend, and it's also something where he feels that that's a good way to protect his political backside in New York.
Well, do you think, I mean, you know, one of the things we'd like to see in the country is we'd like to see everybody get along, and New York's been a place where that's happened. And do you think that there's sort of a polarization that's taking place? I mean, does it have a racial polarization or ethnic polarization or economic polarization? I mean, New York, at least for a while, I mean, was a real place for everyone, and there's a sort of a, in many ways, they made things work. Do you think it's getting harder to make a big city like New York work with all the different people that live there? Is it getting tougher?
No, I don't think it's getting tougher. I think a lot of it is a question of leadership. I don't think Mr. de Blasio has a real firm grip on leadership. And some people I know, including people who've known him a long time, say that he's a very ambitious man and has it very much in mind to use the mayoralty of New York as a springboard for further and greater success as a politician. While some people I know spoke of perhaps his aspirations to become governor of New York, I think you see from the news where he's in Iowa and New Hampshire and so forth, that he's actually testing the waters to see if he could not be the far left alternative to Mrs. Clinton, who is, of course, speeding at the speed of light to the left to try to occupy that ground and thus be able to do well in the primaries. I hope I'm not dodging your question, but I do think that there are certain signs in New York that not so much of racial polarization, but a decline in quality of life. For example, the murder rate has gone up. The crime rate has gone up. This was widely predicted by observers when de Blasio, who ran explicitly on a policy of undoing the stop and frisk laws and operations of the police department. which took an enormous number of illegal guns off the sidewalks of New York.
Which, you know, the idea, as I understand it, you can't easily have a sidearm, at least in a holster walking around New York City. You have pretty stringent gun control laws there, do you not? I mean, it's contrasted with Georgia, where it's pretty liberal here in regards to that. Is that a fair statement?
The New York gun laws have been strict for a long time. They're now under challenge by reason of the Supreme Court's decisions in respect of the Second Amendment, which has given life to the idea that the right to bear arms is every bit as sacred as the right to free speech, which was not a view that was shared by the predominantly liberal view that prevailed in the Supreme Court for so many years. So that the increase in crime is a problem. I see it as a personal thing. I haven't done any studies, obviously, but I see a lot more in the way of panhandling on the subways, panhandling on the street, and those people have come back, and the laws that were being enforced to a great degree under Bloomberg are simply, it seems to me, is a personal viewpoint, they're not being enforced. So you see that. You also see that he wants to expand the right, for example, to rent control, which has long distorted the law in New York with respect to tenancies, and kept people in dirt cheap apartments for years and years and years, so that they may be spending, $300 for a 3 or 4 room apartment that they've had literally since, or has been in their family since the rent control laws were established during the Second World War.
Well, now, obviously there are issues in New York, but I mean, just an external observer seeing that great metropolis, Gotham City, but the wealth that's accumulated there is pretty extraordinary, isn't it? People come from all over the world, so the price of real estate is rocketing. The wealthiest people in the world tend to make that their home. A great amount of wealth is generated on the stock market, the different kinds of financial industry. So at the same time, there's this very elite group of people with great amounts of wealth, and then everyone else is there. And the tensions, but maybe the mayor there just reflects some of the economic tensions the country is facing. There's the idea of inequality is being fostered by the economic system, and ergo the job of politicians is to reverse the excesses of the marketplace. Now, I'm throwing you a little pitch there, but I mean, yes, no, what do you think about that?
Well, inequality is certainly a theme that Mrs. Clinton has begun to hammer on, that de Blasio has been hammering on, and I think and Bernie Sanders from Vermont, who's now declared as a Democratic candidate, has been hammering on. And I have to say a little bit they're on to something there, both as a rhetorical matter and as an item of fairness. In rhetoric, of course, it's always very popular to pound the table for equality, and that is egalitarianism has always been a theme in American democracy. There's no question about that. In substance, the complaints, at least in one rather technical area, I think are fairly taken, and that has to do with the so-called carried interest taxation, treatment of carried interest in hedge funds, which is rather technical. But
what is that, Tom? I'll ask.
Well, I mean, as I understand it, I'm not a tax lawyer, but my understanding is that these investments that are created by tax funds they create partnerships, and the partners come in and they invest in Robinson Fund number 1.
Yes, right.
And maybe that fund is going to invest in energy.
Yes.
And then 3 years later they'll create Robinson Fund number 2, and that's going to be invested in transportation.
Yes. Yes.
3 years later they'll do something in electronics or the digital world, and those investments for people in the hedge fund industry are not treated as income when they are realized. They're treated as capital gains, even though that's the way in which these people make their money. That is the way in which they have revenue to send their children to school and put food on the table and so forth.
So they can extract the money from their business as capital gains, whereas other people just have regular income.
And of course, I haven't any real idea about this, but certainly Senator Schumer still supports this. He's slated to be the next majority leader of the Senate, and if the Democrats were to take control, and he's the senator from New York, and he gets a lot of contributions from these people. So it's not a Democrat or Republican issue as I see it. It's an issue of fairness, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I do think there's an argument there that people who, as you put it, make their livings this way ought to pay income tax like the rest of us.
Well, isn't that, just to sort of intercede a little bit and discuss some of the, New York's a very interesting place. It has this great sort of power of capitalism there. There's sort of an underclass that's there. We have this societal tension. There's a new mayor. We have all this just thrashing about. In some of it is the tax system. The tax code. And so you picked a word that's very. When I hear the word, I think we have to focus a lot on it. And that's fairness. What is fair? And if it's the word, it has a lot of connotations to a lot of people, and it's difficult to really define it. Maybe it's like obscenity. People know it I can know unfairness when I see it, just with obscenity. But the tax code it's such a arcane, complicated document, thousands of pages long. It's easy to find ways to avoid taxes, and if you don't find these ways, the expropriative taxes are pretty high. In New York, there are lots and lots of taxes, are they not? You have how many taxes of all types? So unless people are constantly figuring out ways to avoid these high taxes, state and city taxes there.
Yeah, well, I think if you're making a living of a professional in New York City, you don't start working for yourself until July.
Yes.
The first 6 months goes to Uncle Sam, to Governor Cuomo, and to Mayor de Blasio. And while the city of New York and the prosperity that is generated in the stock market and through tourism and show business and so forth, while that's doing pretty well for the city, fueled, I might add, by new generations of immigrants that continually pile into New York to great good effect. But the people upstate who are laboring under New York and federal taxes aren't doing so well. And much of western New York is in very poor shape. Buffalo and Rochester, which used to be wonderfully prosperous cities when I was a boy, now compete with Cleveland and Detroit for the most impoverished cities that really have nothing going for them.
Does the solution for upstate New York lie underground, Tom?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up.
I'm going to throw you another soft pitch.
Governor Cuomo waited till he was reelected in November to decide that somehow the health of New York of New Yorkers was threatened by fracking. The Marcellus Shale formation, which undergirds Maryland, West Virginia, Ohio, a lot in Pennsylvania, and a lot in New York, areas of Pennsylvania where shale oil was drilled have become prosperous, or relatively prosperous, and certainly compared to where they were. And the governor, in a completely bogus report by his health commissioner, relied on that to ban fracking in New York, only to see last Thursday the Environmental Protection Administration, which has a vested interest in the environment and is very green, came out with a long, detailed study saying there is no proof of any significant danger of water contamination by shale oil drilling. This is completely at odds with the bogus report of the Department of Health in New York, and it should shame Governor Cuomo, who has kept prosperity from his own citizens.
Is there, we've discussed this a little bit in another, I guess, interchange, about the sort of the mythology or the sort of the things that limit free discussion about different kinds of issues. So if you were in New York City and you were having a discussion in whatever circles in which you move, I know they're variegated, but the idea that you would be for fracking or wouldn't that be sort of an anathema to people? I mean, is the cultural, I guess, idea there so firmly implanted on some issues that it's impossible to have any other viewpoint, and thus the polarization of the country continues, and the people would not, or is there room for enlightenment, can I say that, on that subject in New York?
Well, I don't know whether it's just New York, but I think the environmental movement has gone, about 7 flavors too far, it seems to me. While I have many very good friends who've done nothing for their whole lives but work in that area and have done nobly, I think when it comes to the welfare of our citizens and creating bogus reports to ban fracking in an entire state, then something has gone terribly wrong. In terms of speech, I think green opinions, the green point of view has become like religion, and to speak against it a sacrilege. I remember driving by a church
Yes.
in Maine last summer. One of those beautiful little New England churches,
Yes.
white
In the
paint,
little church in the Wildwood, is that
that sort of thing. And it said, friends don't let friends deny climate change.
Yes.
And so, I mean, you look at that and you say to yourself, I mean, this is straight out of a sort of a police state of some kind, where people are promoting an orthodoxy by telling people not to let their friends say things. And this was on a
Yes.
placard in front of a church, for heaven's sake.
It was a rather tough winter up there, wasn't it, Tom? I mean, just sort of, if I could say that, this past winter, was it pretty cold up there?
Yeah, it was pretty cold, and there was a lot of snow. I heard something fascinating about that. Would you like me to throw this pearl out there?
Absolutely, Tom. Toss it to me.
Yeah, I have a friend, a physical therapist in New York, who spends a lot of time looking at the Weather Channel, and he's become something of an expert on
Yes.
weather. And he said that the harshness of the winter in, say, the northeast quadrant of the United States may be utterly predicted by gauging the snowfall in Siberia
Yes.
in the October of the year just prior to the
Yes.
beginning of winter, and that the 2 past winters we've had in New York have been quite severe, both in terms of temperature and snowfall. Of course, with nothing compared to Boston, which set a record
Yes.
for its
Yes.
snowfall.
Yes.
And lo and behold, the snowfall in Siberia the year in 2013 was the highest ever recorded in October.
Yes.
And so, well, we'll see, they said, what will happen in 2014.
Yes.
And the snowfall in Siberia exceeded that
Yes.
even of the previous year. So we had these 2 tough winters. So that's just something to keep
Oh,
your eye on.
I'll throw that out. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I guess you sort of get into a point here. I think it's worth making, is that we have debates on any issues. We need to have appropriate data, neutral scientific inquiry, and attention to details. I'll say this is about climate warming. I don't want to get too far off track. But it's obvious that we've had enormous climatic changes ever since the world has occurred, and there are lots of things that cause climatic change. So you have the axis of the Earth changes, you have different kinds of sunspots that occur, all kinds of things drive subtle changes in the climate. So we can always anticipate climate change, it's just a given. So in New York, if you live in Manhattan, 10,000 years ago, you were under a mile of ice, things that we have, the snowball Earth, all these changes are taking place repeatedly. And the question is whether or not carbon dioxide changes as we have the forests, particularly in South America, have been diminished, whether that plays a role in what's up. And also, I think cows play a role, if I can understand this correctly. Lots of methane generated, but we have these events going on around the world, and we do have some changes in carbon dioxide in the Earth. And so, is that going to play a role in this? That's the question. Whether or not how much of an influence that's going to have, because we have this cyclical viewpoint, and it would be wise for our species just to anticipate climatic change, to anticipate it, and be able to respond to it, because if we do have a particularly, let's see, harsh summer in India, millions of people will die, if I use hyperbole here, but we'd have to be able to move, transport food and people and do things, and just, we have cyclones that come in, and it's an interconnected world. So being able to move resources around probably is the most intelligent thing to do. But the idea that humans by themselves could impact the climate, well, they might be able to do that. That's a question I would say.
Yeah,
let's get some data.
That's a remedy question. You know, it's not without significance that this problem of the world falling in, which is what the climate change people are telling us. You know, that started out as global warming.
It's no longer called that.
Now it's called climate change. So that kind of works either way. You know, if it's a cold winter or a colder winter, then that's climate change. If it's a hotter summer, then that's climate change. You know, and I'm a great believer in science, but I think the science here has been perverted by people who have it in mind to capitalize on a particular viewpoint, one that is held almost biblically. And I think that there are a lot of things that don't work with their theory. For example, the fact that the temperatures have been cooler over the last 30 years. That wasn't supposed to happen.
Right.
It does make one nervous to think that that this orthodoxy that is one finds you know, in the editorial pages is being reinforced by scientists who have themselves been subverted and seduced by I don't know, by objectives that are more important than the pursuit of truth.
Well, you know, I'll say this. I mean, I don't totally discard the papers that are appearing in reputable journals. I don't disregard that. And I think there is some evidence about CO2 changes. However, to me, the question is, how does this balance against all the other factors that influence climate? So there are 5 or 6 or 7 factors, to just name a few. Each of them they play some kind of role. And a transitory increase in CO2, I mean, maybe that's not such a big deal if the Earth is wobbling on its axis a little more. It's extremely complicated. We can say that the approaching 8 billion people on the Earth, it's a lot of people out there, and it's going to require some kind of special attention with all of those people out there. And it's a little bit like life on a submarine. We have so many, if we started out on a pleasure cruise and then we're all jammed in on a submarine, it's going to require some kind of particular attention to the details of living on the submarine. On the other hand, it does appear to me that there's a card in the deck of arch environmentalists to sort of a power dynamic issue, that if you believe that that you have the power to basically stop mercantile activities because they might particularly injure people, then it's a real aggregation of power, and the sort of things that you propagate could be a big deal. And sort of my point is to say this, is if you really, the real issue is the complexity of 8 billion people on the planet, how to get them along, how to move resources around. And if you diminish, shall we say, fracking, the economic advantage that gives is going to make our planet that much better, because we'll have the resources in order to feed people in India. So dropping the world's GNP is never considered when people propagate environmental regulations that the cost is not considered as to what this is going to cost. And we also have national strategic issues involved here. The fact that fracking is so, the technology has been so powerful, it's changing the world economic balance, and it's making the U.S. less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and it's really making our country a lot more economically and politically secure. So those advantages have to be weighed against the nebulous, in my opinion, the nebulous impact on climate. And I don't discount the idea that these CO2 levels could play some kind of role in what's going on, but it's some time off. There are things that could happen, and we ought to have an intelligent discussion about it.
Yeah, well, you raise a good point. People have ignored entirely the fact that the increase in CO2 has, in their view, has created global warming and the rise in seas. But there have been good effects. There have been more places put under tillage and agriculture, and it's of interest to just unite the fracking issue with the green issue, that the United States was the only country that complied with the Kyoto Accords to lower CO2 emissions. Now, how did they do that? They did it not by cutting back on their industry or anything of that sort. They did it by switching from, in their energy consumption, from oil and coal to natural gas, which is much cleaner.
Yes.
In production of CO2. So you have something that the environmentalists fiercely oppose, fracking.
Yes, right.
And that is the only thing that made it possible for the United States to comply with the very stringent Kyoto Accords that were the very heart and soul of the environmental movement. So Germany didn't comply, England didn't comply, Japan didn't comply. We complied. Why did we do it? Because of American know-how, because of the use of science, and good old American risk-taking. I'll bet on that any time.
And the financial motivation is not to be discounted. I mean, that's a very powerful incentive for people, and it's Adam Smith at work.
Well, it's not just incentive, it's also private property. Because in most countries, you can't find private property. And the people who own the property where the fracking is going on can lease that property. It's their own decision to make. And if they want to make a deal with the oil company, they can do it. That's not true everywhere in the world.
Well, I'm glad we have a ringing defense of private property as we conclude our interchange tonight. I'll make one comment. I mean, both of us have spent some time in China, and particularly there's another issue besides climate change, which is just raw pollution. So the air in many places there is just unbreathable. It's, if you have to go there to really believe it as to how polluted the situation is, and it's referable to use of cold, an enormous amount of cold, and the idea that if the Chinese could frack, so to speak, and produce natural gas the way we do it, it would be a solution for their environmental problems. So rather than opposing fracking, it could be a worldwide solution to a lot of the problems.
And in the meantime, we might lift the embargo of the United States has on the export of oil and natural gas, so that the Chinese, when they haven't gotten quite to fracking yet, they can have cleaner air through fewer emissions by using our energy.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I hope some listening politician, if there happens to be one, may take the idea of exporting oil to heart, and maybe we could do that as well.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being with us.
It's always a pleasure. Nice to be here.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.